In the autumn of 2001, at the start of the largest Western military deployment since the Gulf War, Britain's most capable Special Forces regiment flew to Afghanistan, drove their Land Rovers across territory, falling to the coalition by the week, and came home without firing a single shot. Not because the war had ended, because the American military command had not allocated them a target worth having. 2 full squadrons had deployed to the biggest conflict of their generation and spent a fortnight achieving nothing of consequence before being recalled to Herefordshire. The most decorated Special Forces regiment in the world had gone to war and come home. What happened next required a Prime Minister's personal intervention. 8 men jumping from a transport aircraft at high altitude into an unmapped desert in the dark, and a 4-hour battle that the regiment's historians classify as the largest known SAS operation since the Second World War. The intelligence recovered from that compound shaped coalition operations across Afghanistan for years. The names of the men who set the whole thing in motion have never been publicly released. Most of the British public has never been told any of it occurred. Tell me in the comments, have you ever heard of Operation Trent before today? Because what you are about to discover will make you question everything you thought you knew about how Britain's most elite soldiers almost missed their own war. Now let's go. The invasion of Afghanistan began on the 7th of October, 2001, 26 days after the attacks on New York and Washington that had made it inevitable. Britain committed immediately and publicly. Prime Minister Tony Blair had positioned himself from the first hours of the crisis as America's most significant ally, not a peripheral supporter, but a co-author of the response. British forces would be in Afghanistan from the beginning, he insisted, not as a symbolic gesture, but as proof that the world's most capable alliance was operating as one. The rhetoric matched the political investment. The operational reality that followed was considerably more complicated. America's strategy in the early weeks of the campaign was built around 2 elements: precision air power from carrier groups in the Arabian Sea and proxy ground forces in the form of the Afghan Northern Alliance. Green Berets from the 5th Special Forces Group rode on horseback alongside Northern Alliance commanders, calling in airstrikes on Taliban positions and directing the rapid collapse of a regime that proved far less capable of sustained conventional resistance than pre-war assessments had predicted. It was an extraordinary and improvised form of warfare, and it worked with a speed that surprised even its architects. But it was an American campaign built around American intelligence targets, American operational timelines, and American command priorities. The question of what allies could contribute, beyond diplomatic solidarity and military symbolism, was answered with considerably less clarity than the question of whether they were committed. The Special Air Service deployed in mid-October of 2001. A Squadron NG Squadron of the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment, reinforced by elements from the Territorial Army's own SAS regiments, flew to northwest Afghanistan under the command of United States Central Command, known as CENTCOM, and began what was designated Operation Determine, a reconnaissance and bomb damage assessment mission. Not a direct action force with its own target list. A reconnaissance element attached to an American campaign operating on American priorities. The soldiers drove Land Rover desert patrol vehicles through territory that was already changing hands. They observed. They assessed damage to infrastructure the coalition's aircraft had already struck. They waited for a direct action tasking that did not arrive. No patrol made enemy contact. The missions dried up. After approximately 2 weeks, both squadrons were recalled to their barracks in Herefordshire. To understand how humiliating this was, institutionally, requires understanding the regiment's culture. The SAS exists to perform operations that other forces cannot. It recruits the most capable soldiers from across the British military. subjects them to a selection process designed to eliminate everyone who cannot sustain extraordinary effort under conditions of sustained uncertainty and physical extremity, and trains the survivors to operate against the hardest targets in the most demanding environments available. To deploy that force to a war and give it nothing to do, to recall it after 2 weeks of uneventful reconnaissance while the war continued without it, was not merely a disappointment. It was a failure of purpose so fundamental that the entire political logic of Britain's military commitment to Afghanistan was threatened by it. The structural cause was not difficult to identify. American CENTCOM commanders were consuming their attention on 2 priorities: exploiting the Northern Alliance's momentum across northern Afghanistan and attempting to locate Osama bin Laden in the Tora Bora mountain complex near the Pakistani border. Special operations targets were closely managed. American units held priority on direct action tasks, and the appetite for directing Allied special forces onto objectives that American operators could have taken themselves was limited. Allied special forces fit awkwardly into this model. They were too capable to use as simple liaison elements, and too allied to be trusted with American intelligence targets. The political arithmetic was plain. Blair had positioned Britain as America's indispensable partner, not merely in diplomatic rhetoric, but in the specific argument, made publicly and repeatedly, that British special forces and British intelligence were uniquely valuable to the coalition. 2 SAS squadrons returning from Afghanistan without having engaged, the enemy was not evidence of partnership. It was evidence of its absence. The Prime Minister intervened directly with the American command structure, pressing for a British direct action mission. British intelligence had identified a target that American analysts had rated as insufficiently important to warrant a ground assault. The Americans agreed to support a British operation, but could not commit the full air support package the mission would have preferred. What CENTCOM could offer was a limited window of close air support from carrier-based aircraft, available only during daylight hours, limited to a single committed hour of on-call support before the aircraft would be released to other taskings. A regiment that had built its legend around night operations would have to assault a fortified position in full morning light. The commanding officer of 22 SAS accepted this constraint. He had spent his entire career working toward exactly the kind of mission this represented, and no scheduling difficulty was going to be the reason he declined it. The nature of what he had accepted, and why it was the kind of acceptance that defines everything the regiment is, begins not in this desert, but a different one, 60 years earlier. The Special Air Service began in North Africa. In July of 1941, on the strength of a proposal submitted by Lieutenant David Stirling of the Scots Guards to the Deputy Commander-in-Chief of Middle East Forces, a unit was authorized that no conventional military establishment would have invented from scratch. 6 officers and 60 men, drawn from commando formations the High Command had largely written off as an expensive inconvenience, were given permission to conduct operations behind Axis lines in the North African desert. The official designation was L Detachment, Special Air Service Brigade. The name was chosen partly to suggest a larger formation than actually existed. The SAS has been managing information about itself with precision ever since. Stirling's insight was not tactically sophisticated. It was geographically obvious, once seen. The vast interior of the North African desert was unmapped, essentially ungoverned, and ignored by both sides. Axis forces defended the coastal roads and the airfields beside them. The desert behind those airfields was, by any conventional military assessment, irrelevant terrain producing no tactical advantage for anyone capable of exploiting it. Stirling saw it differently. The desert was not an obstacle to be crossed in order to reach the enemy. It was the approach route to every airfield, supply depot, and communications node, that the Axis forces were defending from the sea and from the sky, but not from the interior, because no one had thought to defend from the interior, because no one had thought anyone could come from there. Not a commando formation designed to assault defended coastlines. A regiment built to appear from terrain the enemy had dismissed. In the first 18 months of the regiment's existence, Sterling's men destroyed more than 400 Axis aircraft on the ground, not in air battles or conventional engagements, but in vehicle-mounted raids that appeared from terrain the Axis forces had written off as impassable and disappeared back into it before a coherent response could form. The German High Command gave Sterling a name: the Phantom Major, because he and his men appeared from nowhere and vanished into nothing, striking from country the enemy had never considered worth defending. The regiment was disbanded after the Second World War, reformed as a territorial unit in 1947, and reconstituted as the 22nd Special Air Service Regiment in 1952. Since then, 22 SAS has fought in Borneo, in Dhofar, in Northern Ireland, in the Falklands, in the Gulf, in the Balkans, in Sierra Leone, and in numerous other places the Ministry of Defense prefers not to confirm. Each generation has absorbed the institutional knowledge of the previous one, not formally or through manuals, but through the process by which professional soldiers learn from the people who have done what they are being prepared to do. 22nd SAS is structured around 4 squadrons. Each squadron is divided into 4 troops of 16 men, each troop specializing in a different method of insertion and a different type of operating environment. Mobility Troop uses vehicles and heavy weapons, the direct descendant of Sterling's Jeep columns. Land Rovers, where the original Jeeps were. The weapons updated, but the doctrine of the fast vehicle-mounted raid identical. Air Troop specializes in parachute insertion, including the halo technique, high-altitude low opening, which requires the operator to exit the aircraft at heights where the ambient air temperature will freeze exposed skin, freefall through several thousand feet of sky, and deploy the parachute at 4,000 feet to avoid the visual and radar signature that a high-altitude opening would produce. The regiment had trained for wartime halo insertion since the capability was developed. It had never used it in a combat operation. The force that would execute Operation Trent included not only regular soldiers from 22 SAS, but members of the Territorial Army's own SAS reserve regiments, civilian professionals who had passed the same selection process as their regular counterparts and who deployed alongside them when the mission required. By the time Operation Trent received its authorization, the men of both squadrons had been home from their Afghanistan reconnaissance for several weeks. The SAS's institutional culture does not accommodate graceful inaction. It is not designed to. The call to return was, in every meaningful sense, welcome. British intelligence had located the target, not in the Tora Bora Mountains where the Americans were hunting bin Laden. In the Registan Desert, one of the largest and most desolate desert regions in Afghanistan, a sprawling, empty plateau in southern Helmand and Kandahar provinces that ran 300 kilometers toward the Pakistani border. The name derives from the Persian for land of sand, and the name earns its meaning. It is a landscape of shifting dunes and flat plains at altitudes between 800 and 1,200 meters, enormous and featureless and empty of the population and the road network that give military forces their reference points and their routes. The facility sat at the base of the Khoai Malik Mountain, the King's Mountain in Pashto, 1,800 meters of rock rising from the desert floor, 20 kilometers north of the border with Pakistan. At its base, a complex of houses, compounds, and caves had been developed over time into an installation that served 3 overlapping purposes: an opium processing and storage operation, a Taliban and al-Qaeda headquarters, and a staging post for moving personnel, equipment, and funds across the border. Trench lines had been dug around the compound's approaches. Makeshift bunkers provided prepared firing positions at its outer perimeter. The mountain behind offered depth, concealment, and a cave system that honeycombed its lower slopes, a feature that made the position difficult to destroy from the air without a ground force to clear what a bomb could not reach. The intelligence picture assessed between 80 and 100 fighters at the facility, the majority of them al-Qaeda foreign nationals, not Afghan Taliban members, but ideological volunteers who had come to Afghanistan from across the Arab world and beyond, trained at some of al-Qaeda's principal facilities, with morale that the intelligence assessment characterized as high. These were not conscripts. They were not irregulars motivated by local grievance or tribal obligation. They were men who had come to Afghanistan specifically to fight, and who had made peace with where that purpose led. The American position on the facility was direct. No senior al-Qaeda or Taliban leadership was assessed to be present. No high-value targets. The proportionate response was an airstrike. Obliterate the compounds from altitude, destroy the drugstores, and move on to the next target in a campaign full of higher priority objectives. The British position differed in one specific and consequential respect. The facility almost certainly contained intelligence materials, documents, communications records, the operational paperwork of a network that had been running drugs and fighters across the Afghanistan-Pakistan border for years. An airstrike would incinerate all of it. A ground force could recover it, and British intelligence assessed that what it contained might prove far more valuable than the building housing it. This argument was made to the American command structure and was accepted as the justification for a British ground assault. The commanding officer who accepted the mission had been in uniform since 1984. Lieutenant Colonel Edward Adam Butler was born on the 27th of February, 1962. The younger son of Sir Adam Butler, a conservative member of Parliament, and the grandson of Richard Austin Butler, known universally in British political life as Rab, one of the most consequential domestic politicians of the post-war period. Rab Butler had presided over the Education Act of 1944, had shaped the Conservative Party's post-war economic thinking, and had come closer to becoming Prime Minister than almost anyone who did not actually hold the office. The Butlers had operated at the highest levels of British public life for 2 generations. Edward Butler did not follow them there. He was educated at Eton College before reading politics and international relations at the University of Exeter. He was commissioned into the Royal Green Jackets in August of 1984 and spent the following 17 years accumulating the kind of service record that positions a particular officer for particular responsibilities. He received a mention in dispatches for his service in Northern Ireland in 1991, and the Queen's Commendation for Valuable Service for his work in the former Yugoslavia in the autumn of 1997. He served in Bosnia. He served in Kosovo. He served in Sierra Leone, in the complicated aftermath of conflicts that ended without being fully resolved. He accumulated the experience that cannot be manufactured in training areas or replicated in exercises, the particular knowledge of what men look like when they are genuinely afraid and what they look like when they have moved through fear into something more functional. He became commanding officer of 22 SAS in 2001 at the age of 38, described in his own later account as his career ambition. Not a position at the Ministry of Defense, not a role in the Joint Intelligence Committee or the Foreign Office, where his family's history and his educational background might reasonably have pointed him. At Stirling Lines, Herefordshire, commanding the regiment whose founders he had studied for decades before he was eligible to command it. The man whose grandfather had come within a vote of leading the nation had set his personal measure in a different direction entirely. Butler understood what was actually being asked of him at Bagram Airfield in November of 2001. a military mission shaped by diplomatic requirements, given its dangerous specific form by scheduling constraints imposed by a coalition partner's competing priorities, valuable not only for what it would achieve on the ground, but for what it demonstrated about British capability within an alliance that had not been enthusiastic about giving British forces something meaningful to do. He assessed the mission as feasible if executed with sufficient speed and sufficient aggression. He understood the cost of declining. He said yes. The planning that followed confronted almost immediately the full weight of what the constraints actually meant on the ground. They were not abstract. Each one carried direct implications for a different phase of the operation, and those implications had to be addressed with whatever was available rather than whatever would have been ideal. The maps the SAS planners were working with were the most detailed available for the region. That scale was 1 to 1,500,000, roughly the granularity of a road atlas applied to a desert the size of a small country. At that resolution, the proposed temporary landing zone for the operation was not identifiable as a specific feature. The soldiers who would determine whether the landing zone was suitable would have to do so in person, at night, without a map that helped. The reconnaissance problem was similarly absolute. The standard doctrine for a direct action operation of this scale calls for days of covert target surveillance, small teams in concealed positions watching the compound, counting fighters, mapping weapon positions, identifying fields of fire. CENTCOM's air support scheduling made any reconnaissance of the target site impossible. The 1-hour window of committed close air support had been set around a different campaign's operational tempo, and moving it risked losing it entirely. The assault would go in against a compound the SAS had never closely observed, whose interior the intelligence picture did not describe at the level required, and whose defensive specifics could only be inferred from aerial photography that showed the exterior, but not the cave system behind. The assault would be in daylight. This was not a preference. It was the condition on which the American air support was available. The SAS operates best at night. Darkness eliminates the visual signature of an approaching vehicle column, reduces the range at which a defender can effectively engage, and removes the dust cloud that desert vehicles raise, and that is visible for kilometers in clear air. None of these advantages would exist. The plan had to be built around this fact, rather than around the doctrine that would have preferred to avoid it. G Squadron would provide fire support from 800 meters, its vehicles arranged in a bullhorn formation, allowing overlapping fields of fire across the compound's approaches. Its weapons were formidable. Vehicle-mounted L7A2 general-purpose machine guns in 7.62 millimeter caliber, M2 Browning heavy machine guns in 50 caliber, Milan anti-tank guided missiles capable of destroying hardened positions at range, L16 81mm mortars for indirect fire, and Barrett M82A1 sniper rifles in 50 caliber, capable of accurate engagement at distances that entirely outranged anything in the compound's arsenal. Under the cover of G Squadron's fire and the initial American airstrikes on the opium storage depots, a squadron would assault the compound on foot, clear it, and recover what intelligence it contained. The vehicles for the operation numbered 38 Land Rover desert patrol vehicles, the Pinkies, a designation inherited from an earlier era of desert camouflage, 8 Kawasaki dirt bikes for scouting ahead of and alongside the columns, and 2 Akmat logistics trucks that would serve as motherships for the force, loaded with spare fuel, ammunition, and water. The force was out of range of any coalition artillery. If the American aircraft ran out of ordnance and the assault was still in progress, what A Squadron had in its hands was all it would have. The mathematics of the plan were not complicated, and every man in both squadrons had done them. The margin between what the mission required and what the constraints allowed was understood. It was accepted. The planning moved forward. In mid-November of 2001, A and G squadrons of 22 SAS were covertly reinserted into Bagram airfield under the code name Operation Blood. In the planning rooms at Bagram, the soldiers whose names would not be made public were preparing to do something that no one in the regiment had done before. The night before the assault, 8 men from G Squadron's air troop boarded a transport aircraft at their staging base and prepared for the regiment's first wartime Halo insertion. The aircraft was a C-130 Hercules, flying out of Camp Rhino, a United States Marine Corps forward operating base in southern Helmand Province. The aircraft climbed. At altitude, sources in the public record give figures between 20,000 and 50 feet and 28,000 feet, a discrepancy that has never been resolved and probably reflects the continued classification of operational details. The ambient temperature outside the fuselage was far below zero. At these heights, the human body cannot sustain function without supplemental oxygen, and the 8 men preparing to leave the aircraft were breathing through the systems designed to keep them functional long enough to use the equipment they were about to need. The cold at altitude is not simply an environmental condition, it is a tactical problem. It affects the function of equipment, the dexterity of hands that must operate that equipment, and the fine motor coordination that every phase of what comes next requires to go correctly. The men inside that aircraft had prepared for this specifically. Preparation does not eliminate the cold. One by one, they went out. The Halo technique achieves its military value through a specific physical fact. A human body in free fall is harder to detect from the ground than a deployed parachute. It produces a smaller radar return, a smaller visual signature, and it arrives at its destination with less warning than a conventional parachute deployment would provide. The cost of this advantage is that the parachute is kept closed during the descent, which means the operator is free-falling through several thousand feet of sky, accelerating through the dark toward a landing zone whose precise characteristics are still to be confirmed, without the reassurance of a deployed canopy above him. The parachute opens automatically at 4,000 feet. 8 men fell through the Afghan winter night over the Registan desert, each one alone in the seconds between the aircraft and the landing. They landed on sand. The desert surface accepted them. They established security around their landing positions and began what they had come to do. The proposed temporary landing zone had to be assessed for load-bearing capacity. Could this specific section of Registan sand support the weight of a fully laden C-130 Hercules, decelerating along its surface, with a rear ramp lowered and vehicles driving off the back? The answer was in the soil, and the only way to determine it was to walk the surface and make a professional judgment. The 8-man team walked it. They determined it was adequate. They then marked out the landing strip, 900 feet long, 40 feet wide, using infrared torches that were invisible to the naked eye in the dark below them, but clearly legible through the night vision equipment fitted to the cockpits of the aircraft approaching from Bagram. With the landing strip confirmed and marked, they moved to concealed layup positions and waited. 17 hours. The waiting is its own discipline, and it is not patience in any ordinary sense, because patience implies the possibility of an alternative, of moving, of acting, of changing the nature of what the situation requires. This was not patience. It was professional stillness, sustained across a span of time that would erode most people's capacity to maintain it, in a desert that Taliban and al-Qaeda forces moved through as a matter of operational routine. With the continuous knowledge that 8 men discovered in that desert at that moment meant the failure of an operation that a prime minister had argued for, and that 120 of their colleagues were committed to executing. They did not move unnecessarily. Sound in a desert environment travels. Dust, disturbed by movement, settles slowly and remains visible. Silhouette against a desert sky is detectable by a trained observer at distances that feel implausible until experienced. The team maintained observation. They maintained security. They waited for the sound that would tell them the next phase had begun. If they were found, 8 men alone with no immediate extraction available and insufficient firepower to hold a position against a serious response, the operation ended before the C-130s left Bagram. The entire sequence of events that followed depended on those 8 soldiers remaining invisible for 17 consecutive hours in a desert where the enemy operated. No unit in the regiment had performed this in combat before. The men in those concealed positions understood what that precedent meant in terms of the margin for error. Their names are not in the public record. The Ministry of Defense has not identified them. The regiment does not publicize them as a matter of principle and practice. The 8 soldiers who performed the most technically demanding preparatory act in the largest post-war SAS operation, who fell from an aircraft at altitude in sub-zero temperatures in the dark onto an unmapped desert, and spent 17 hours alone in enemy territory, ensuring that 120 of their colleagues could execute the mission, remain to the British public completely unknown. What they left behind them on the desert floor of the Registan was invisible to anyone without the equipment to see it. And then, out of the dark to the north, the first C-130 appeared on approach. 6 Hercules transports from Bagram descended toward the desert strip in the first wave, following the infrared markers the air troop pathfinders had laid hours before. The aircraft were moving when they landed. Each rear ramp was already lowered before the wheels made contact with the desert surface, and the Land Rovers on board did not wait for the aircraft to stop. As each transport decelerated along the 900-foot strip, vehicles drove off the ramp and onto the desert floor, moving immediately into all-round defensive positions, while the aircraft turned and accelerated away. The second wave of 6 Hercules followed. From the moment the first aircraft touched the Registan to the departure of the last. 30 minutes. 120 or more SAS operators, regular soldiers, and territorial army reservists together were on the ground in the desert in the dark, with their vehicles and their weapons, and the aircraft that had brought them were already airborne again and departing. The air troop pathfinders, emerging from their concealed positions, guided the assembling force with their infrared signals. 38 Land Rover Pinkies, 8 Kawasaki dirt bikes, and 2 Akhmat logistics trucks had been on the Registan desert floor by the time the last aircraft disappeared. The largest vehicle-mounted SAS force assembled for a wartime operation since the Second World War was in the field. One Land Rover suffered an engine failure during the forming up process. The vehicle would not be repaired in the time available, and its 3-man crew was ordered to remain with it, to guard it, to wait in the desert where the force had assembled, while everyone else moved toward the objective 120 miles away. They would not fight today. They would wait for the assault force to return. 3 men were the people Operation Trent left behind, not through any failure of their own, but through mechanical misfortune and the operational imperative that the timing could not be extended to fix it. The 8 Kawasaki motorcycles went first, their riders moving ahead of and alongside the columns as the force organized and began moving. The columns moved through the Afghan dark, the Akhmat trucks in the center of each formation. The fine dust of the Registan accumulates in the hollows and the low areas of the desert floor and is disturbed by the passage of vehicles in a way that produces a cloud that hangs in the air long after the vehicles have passed. At night, in darkness, this is a navigational inconvenience. In the growing light of the approaching morning, it would be something else entirely. The 120 miles passed without incident. The columns reached the forming up point in the last darkness before dawn and divided. A squadron moved into its assault positions below and to the south of the compound. G Squadron drove to the line 800 meters from the target and deployed its vehicles into the bullhorn formation, the pattern designed to allow overlapping fire from multiple angles across the compound's approaches simultaneously. The mortar teams laid their tubes and calculated ranges. The sniper teams with their Barrett M82A1 rifles identified and ranged their firing positions. The heavy machine guns were elevated and registered on the compound's outer perimeter. G Squadron was ready. In the growing morning light, a squadron's commanders observed the compound through their optics for the first time at close range, a cluster of buildings at the base of a mountain, exactly as the intelligence picture had described. Trench lines clearly visible, running along the compound's outer approaches. The elevation advantage of the defensive position was immediately apparent. The compound, sitting above the desert floor, with defenders able to observe anything approaching from any direction, across distances that made engagement possible long before an attacker reached the perimeter. And they had been watching the dust column rising from the Registan for some time. Just after 7 o'clock in the morning, a squadron's observers watched the first fighters move in the trench lines. The defenders had seen the approaching column. They were not running. They were moving between their defensive positions with the deliberate purpose of men who have been expecting a fight and have prepared for it. The American aircraft went in first. U.S. Navy FA-18 Hornets and F-14 Tomcats made their opening passes on the compound's opium storage depots, the most important economic asset the facility possessed and the most clearly identifiable external target for the preparatory strike. Maverick missiles struck the storage buildings. Cannon rounds swept the fuel and materials that surrounded them. The depots ignited. 50 million pounds worth of processed opium, refined, packaged, and staged for transport across the border, burned in the Helmand morning. From a squadron's positions on the desert floor below, the smoke was visible rising against the mountain's face. The fighters in the trench lines did not scatter. A squadron moved at high speed. The Land Rover Pinkies accelerated toward the compound across open desert, their vehicle-mounted weapons engaging the defensive positions as they closed the distance. From the trench lines and from the bunkers at the compound's outer perimeter, RPG-7 rockets arced outward toward the approaching vehicles. The characteristic warping sound of rocket-propelled grenades passing at close range is not something that the ear processes in the same register as other battlefield sounds. AK-47 fire swept the desert ahead of the compound in the direction of a squadron's advance. The Pinkies drove through it. G Squadron's bullhorn formation opened fire simultaneously from 800 meters. The 50 caliber M2 Browning heavy machine guns put sustained fire across the trench lines, each round capable of defeating light cover and forcing defenders behind it to remain below the parapet. The 7.62mm general-purpose machine gun crews swept the approaches. The 81mm mortars put rounds onto the bunkers and onto the identified assembly points behind the outer perimeter. Milan missiles tracked into the heavier defensive structures that the direct-fire weapons were not penetrating. Barrett snipers engaged individual fighters who presented themselves above the trench line, at ranges where the compound's own weapons could not reach back. G Squadron's fire was not symbolic. It was sustained and heavy, and designed to suppress the compound's defenders long enough for A Squadron to close the distance across the open ground. A squadron closed to within meters of the outer perimeter and stopped. The vehicles pulled up as close as the ground would allow, and the soldiers dismounted. From this point, the assault was a foot operation over difficult terrain toward fortified positions in full daylight. A squadron split into two-man teams and began the pepper-potting advance, one man dropping into a firing position and engaging the enemy ahead, while his partner moved forward, then switching, each bound across the approach covered by the fire of the man behind. The technique is unchanged from its origins in the fundamentals of infantry fire and movement. The application of it against trained, motivated fighters in prepared trench positions on high ground in broad daylight. Without the close air support the doctrine normally assumes will be available, is what the technique exists for when conditions remove everything else. The U.S. Navy aircraft returned for additional sorties within their committed window. Satellite-guided bombs took out bunkers that had pinned elements of A Squadron's advance. Additional strafing runs swept the trench lines ahead of the assaulting soldiers. During the advance, the first SAS soldier was wounded, hit while crossing the open ground toward the first trench line. Two of his colleagues moved forward under fire, without orders and without pause, reached him, and carried him back to a position where he could be treated. Then they went back into the advance. No formal citation records this. It is simply what happened, and it is more legible as a statement about the regiment's culture than any formal account of it would be. The al-Qaeda fighters defending Khor Malik did not behave as trained defenders of a prepared position normally behave. A prepared defensive position rewards patience. The act of staying behind cover and forcing an attacker to spend casualties and time eliminating each position in sequence. The fighters in the compound's trench lines did not stay behind cover. They came out, not in retreat, but forward. They emerged from prepared positions while firing and moved toward a squadron rather than waiting for a squadron to reach them. One SAS participant, in an account that entered the public record years after the operation, described them as men for whom surrender was the last thing on their minds. Fighters who would run out from the front of their positions while firing, who required killing rather than suppressing, who had come to the Khor Malik compound from other countries for exactly this purpose. The FA-18s and Tomcats flew their final sorties. One aircraft, on its last pass with its M61 Vulcan cannon, after expending every other weapon in its complement, swept a position in the compound's outer approaches and narrowly missed members of G Squadron in the process. The precise margin has never been disclosed. The incident has never been officially acknowledged. It was the predictable product of aircraft flying at the absolute limit of their committed time, coordinating with a ground force in a close-range engagement whose progress had been slower than the planning had anticipated. After that final pass, the aircraft climbed, turned, and departed for the carrier group. Their fuel was exhausted. Their ordnance was gone. The sky above the Khor Malik compound was empty. The assault force was on foot, in open ground, below a fortified position. The aircraft had departed with their ordnance spent. The coalition's artillery was beyond usable range. The fighters in the compound had demonstrated, across the preceding 45 minutes, that they would continue fighting until they physically could not. 200 meters of cleared terrain lay between A Squadron's forward elements and the compound's outer trench lines. And beyond those trench lines, an interior that nobody on the assault had seen, a cave system nobody had mapped, and an unknown number of fighters who were still in it. No air support, no artillery, a fortified mountain position in front of them, fighters who were not breaking, and the order still in effect to advance. G Squadron's fire support base had not paused. The mortar teams worked through their ammunition carefully, mortar ammunition in a desert operation being finite and heavy, and the fire support base unable to resupply. The machine gun crews swept the approaches. The snipers continued engaging fighters moving in the terrain outside the compound's perimeter. But G Squadron's fire could suppress positions at 800 meters. It could not clear them at 200. Only A Squadron could do that, and a squadron's advance had slowed against the compound's outer defenses, not broken, slowed. The distinction matters. A broken assault retreats. A slowed assault requires something to change. From his position in the fire support base, the regimental sergeant major of 22 SAS watched what was happening at the compound's outer perimeter. The RSM is the most senior non-commissioned officer in the regiment, the institutional repository of everything the SAS has learned through its operational history about how soldiers should conduct themselves in the conditions that special forces operations produce. He assessed what he saw. He gathered the commanding officer's headquarters element around him, gave them an instruction that was not in the mission plan, and moved forward. Not toward a command position from which the battle could be observed with better clarity. Into the open ground between G Squadron's vehicles and A Squadron's forward elements. Into the killing ground. Several hundred meters from the compound, still in the open approach, the RSM was struck by an AK-47 round in the leg. He was the second SAS soldier wounded in the operation. His name is not in the public record. What is in the record is what he was doing when the round hit him, how far from the fire support base he had already come, and in what direction. It is more useful information than a name. Across the assault's duration, a number of SAS soldiers owed their survival to the ceramic body armor and tactical helmets they had been issued, equipment the regiment's culture regards with the mild skepticism of professionals who prize freedom of movement over personal protection, and which some soldiers had reportedly required an order to wear before the operation launched. The armor performed its designed function on multiple occasions across the assault's duration. The rounds that struck plates made the orders requiring the armor to be worn retrospectively simple to understand. The advance continued. 12 or more soldiers, the precise number is not established in any public account, reached the outer defensive positions and went inside. They reached the cave entrances and the trench openings at the compound's perimeter and penetrated them. At the range they were now fighting at, G Squadron's heavy weapons were no longer safely usable. The fire support base was 800 meters away, and the assault force was inside the compound, which made any heavy weapon fire toward the interior a threat to the assault force as much as to the enemy. G Squadron snipers continued engaging fighters moving in the terrain outside the perimeter, blocking attempted reinforcement. Inside the compound, a squadron was fighting with what was in its hands. This is what the regiment has always been reduced to. Eventually, when the distance closes far enough, the same fundamental requirement it has faced in every environment it has operated in since 6 officers and 60 men first drove out of the North African desert in 1942. The interior of the cave system at Khoe Malik had not been mapped. The aerial photography showed the compound's external structures. It did not show what lay beyond the cave entrances, how deep the passages ran, how many junctions branched from the main chambers, or what prepared positions might exist at each of those junctions. The soldiers who went inside went without that knowledge, applying the systematic discipline of close quarters clearance to spaces that responded to the same tactical principles. One man covering while his partner moved, the covered position confirmed clear before the advance continued, pace set by what lay ahead, because what lay ahead could only be confirmed by being there. In one cave chamber, 3 fighters were found asleep. This detail appears in the post-operation accounts without elaboration, as though its meaning is self-evident. 3 men in a fortified compound that had been under sustained air attack and then ground assault for the better part of an hour, asleep in an interior chamber deep enough in the cave system that the noise of the battle had not penetrated sufficiently to wake them. Men who had been on elevated defensive alert for days preceding the assault, finally succumbing, in the deepest available cover, to the exhaustion that sustained high alert produces. They woke when the SAS soldiers entered. They reached for their weapons. They were killed before they could bring them to bear. At least 6 al-Qaeda fighters were confirmed killed in close quarters engagements within the caves, killed in the seconds-long engagements that close quarters clearance produces, at distances where the margin for error is measured in centimeters, and where what is recorded afterwards is always a minimum of what occurred. G Squadron's snipers continued their work outside the perimeter, engaging fighters who moved through the terrain, attempting to reach the compound. Several accounts suggest the snipers accounted for a significant portion of the operation's confirmed enemy total. A squadron cleared the headquarters building. The search was conducted with the particular attentiveness of soldiers who have been told that what they are looking for may be more valuable than the building that contains it. Documents were taken. Equipment was identified. 2 laptop computers were found in the al-Qaeda headquarters, accompanied by a substantial quantity of paperwork, files, records, correspondence, the accumulated documentation of a network whose operations they described. During the clearing of the compound's internal buildings, 1 SAS officer was struck by 3 rounds. 2 hit his ceramic body armor plates, the rigid ballistic panels in the front and rear pockets of the plate carrier vest, designed and rated to stop rifle rounds of the caliber being fired at him. They stopped them. The 3rd round struck his water bottle in the pouch on his belt kit. The water bottle is not ballistic equipment and was not designed to stop a rifle round. The round passed through it. The officer walked out of the compound under his own power. He is not identified in any public account. The detail of the 3 rounds and precisely what each surface stopped is in the record. It is more eloquent than a name would be. After approximately 2 hours, from first contact with the compound's outer trench lines to the clearance of the last identified space inside, the facility was secure. The firing from inside the compound stopped. Fighters who remained alive and capable of movement had retreated beyond the effective range of the direct fire weapons. The silence that settled was the specific silence of a place where what needed to happen has happened, and there is nothing left to fight. Both squadrons conducted the tactical withdrawal with the systematic discipline of a regiment that trains for withdrawal as rigorously as it trains for assault. At a distance from the objective sufficient to allow it safely, the 4 SAS soldiers who had been wounded during the operation, none with life-threatening injuries, were transferred to a United States Army CH-47 Chinook helicopter that had been holding at a safe distance for the call. The helicopter took them to Bagram. The remainder of the force returned to the temporary landing zone in the Registan Desert, where the 3-man crew of the broken Land Rover had spent the preceding hours doing precisely what they had been ordered to do. The assault force came back. The vehicle was secured. By the 18th of December, 2001, A and G squadrons of 22 SAS were at their home base in Herefordshire. The operation that had required a Prime Minister's personal intervention to create had been completed in 4 hours of combat, at a cost of 4 men wounded and 0 men killed. Between 18 and 73, al-Qaeda and Taliban fighters had not walked away from the Koh-e Malik compound. The official casualty figures have never been released, and the wide range in the public record reflects that absence directly. The awards that followed were 1 Distinguished Service Order, 2 Military Crosses, 2 Conspicuous Gallantry Crosses, and several mentions in dispatches. The Conspicuous Gallantry Cross is the 2nd highest combat gallantry award in the British military system, 1 tier below the Victoria Cross. In January and February of 2002, as fragments of the operation's story reached the British press through sources not authorized to speak, accounts appeared characterizing the fighting as meriting the Victoria Cross itself. The Ministry of Defense described these accounts as sensationalized, built on speculation as much as documented fact. The core of what those accounts reported was not wrong. No Victoria Crosses were awarded. No official explanation for the gap between what the men had done and what the highest award would have required was ever provided. The specific contents of the 2 laptops and the massive paperwork recovered from the headquarters, have never been disclosed by British intelligence or by any official account of the operation. The Ministry of Defense's eventual characterization of the facility, that its strategic significance had never fully been explained, is as close to an official position as the operation has received. This is not a statement of ignorance. It is the language of an institution that knows and has chosen not to say. The precise date of the operation remains in dispute. Most sources in the public record place it in mid to late November of 2001. The only book written with direct access to men who participated in the fighting, Ultimate Risk by Mark Nicole, published in 2003, gives the date as the 10th of December. The discrepancy has never been resolved in the public record, and the probable explanation is that the precise date remains classified. What is not disputed is that the operation occurred, that it produced the results described, and that the gap between those results and what the British public has ever been told about them is wider and older and more deliberately maintained than most people who have never heard the name Operation Trent would consider acceptable. Blair's argument that a ground assault was warranted because the facility almost certainly contained intelligence an airstrike would have incinerated was vindicated by its own terms. The intelligence was recovered, but the network the facility served was not dismantled. The opium economy adapted, the network reconstituted. By 2006, when British forces returned to Helmand in far greater numbers with a mandate to stabilize the province, the Taliban had rebuilt its operational capability substantially beyond what it had possessed in 2001. The compound at the foot of Koh Malik was gone. The system it served was not. Ed Butler returned to the United Kingdom in December of 2001 with a distinguished service order for his role in commanding the operation. He would be back in Afghanistan in 2006 as Brigadier and Commander of Task Force Helmand. He was the officer responsible for the province where British forces were simultaneously besieged at Sangin, at Kajaki, at Nowzad, and where 88 soldiers in a crumbling district center at Musa Kala spent 56 days under continuous attack before being extracted in decorated tribal lorries by a ceasefire he had ordered and a deal he had brokered. The American command described that deal as a strategic error of the First Order. Butler believed it was the only available option that preserved both his soldiers and any prospect of a political resolution in the north of the province. The man who had accepted an impossible mission in a desert in 2001 spent 2006 managing the consequences of a campaign that the mission he had accepted had not, in the end, fundamentally altered. In July of 1942, David Sterling drove a column of armed jeeps out of the North African desert onto a German-held airfield and destroyed 37 aircraft before vanishing back into the sand. In November of 2001, or December, depending on which account carries the weight of authority, more than 100 men in 37 Land Rovers drove across the Registan desert toward a fortified mountain compound and destroyed what they found inside it, and recovered what couldn't be destroyed from the air. The vehicles were different. The desert was different. The regiment was the same. The 8 men who made that possible fell from a transport aircraft in the dark, marked a runway in the desert with infrared torches, and waited 17 hours alone in enemy territory so that everyone who came after them could do their jobs. Their names are not recorded on any monument in London. They have not been identified in any official account. They are not in the public record in any form that connects a name to what they did in the dark over the Registan Desert in the autumn of 2001. The distance between what those men accomplished and what has been publicly acknowledged is the distance in which the real history of Britain's most elite soldiers is written. If you believe those men deserve to be remembered, leave a comment below. And if you want to understand how the wars that followed were shaped by what was found in that compound, and why they still ended the way they did, watch this next.